Bento and the Sunday Cake, a story from the brilliant mind of Bruner. Bento was a very bright boy, and everyone who lived in his small village always said so. Some of the villagers said it more than once. One of Bento's neighbors was a very old man who always told Bento's mother, "That's a good son you have, and bright too." Each time Bento heard the old man say that, he looked at his mother to see if bright was a good thing to be. When she smiled warmly, Bento knew he liked being called bright, even if he wasn't exactly sure what it meant. While Bento's mother stayed home and worked hard to take care of Bento and their tiny home, his father left the house every day to find work. You see, Bento's village was small, and no one in the village had a big fancy house, and no one drove fancy cars. In fact, there were no cars at all in his village. One time in the city, Bento heard another boy call his village poor. Bento didn't know what that meant, but he loved his village so much that he knew being poor must be a very good thing. Not only was he bright, but Bento was also very observant. Bento's mother often asked, "Bento, why don't you play in the back of the house? There's more room for you to run and play." But Bento preferred to play with his cars and trucks at the front of the house where he could see everything. If he were to play in the back of the house, how would he be able to see the yawning villagers wipe sleep from their eyes as they made their way into the city each morning? If he were to play in the back, how would he see the orange kitten chase the butterflies and hummingbirds down his dirt road? If he were to play in the back, how could he see which food vendor had the most customers as they came home in the hot afternoon sun? Bento always knew which food vendor had the most customers. The first vendor who returned to the village pushing an empty cart would pass in front of his house. "Ah, I see that meat-on-a-stick man has sold all his meat first today," Bento would think to himself. Or maybe it would be the woman who sold bags of nuts. Almost always the last vendor to return to the village, and with his cart still full, would be the rag man. The rag man was kind enough, but it seems like not many people wanted to buy bits of old rag and junk. It was so hard for the rag man to push his cart down the long dirt road that sometimes the weary old man didn't have the energy to go around the potholes. Bento could always tell the rag man needed a rest before his next trip back into the city. Bento felt as though he had his own private parade in the morning and in the later afternoon. His small and meagre front yard was the perfect place to view all the comings and goings. Just a few doors down from Bento's house was an old two-story building. It was the only two-story building in the whole village, and on one long wall was an old faded sign with chipped lettering that said, "Golden Bread Eyrie." In Bento's long 5 years, he had never once seen anyone going into that old place. Bento's father said it used to be a warehouse and bakery in the back, a small store in the front, and the owners used to live upstairs. "But that was long ago," said Papa. "When the bread eyrie went out of business, many villagers had to find work in the city." Bento didn't only notice people coming and going from the village. One day Bento noticed someone coming and staying. Bento saw a car pulling up to the front door of the bread eyrie, a very rare sight indeed, and he was very curious about who was in the car. Bento realized he had some serious observing to do, so he ran inside to ask Mother for a snack. He carried his snack in one hand, and with his other hand he held his shirt tail out like a basket, which was filled with more cars and trucks. Now that he was loaded up, he ran back outside to play, and also to keep an eye on the bread eyrie. Bento made it back outside just in time to see a man carrying a box inside the building. Next, he saw a woman carrying a suitcase in one hand, and he couldn't quite tell what was in the woman's other arm, but suddenly the bundle started to cry. "A baby! Yuck! Why would you bring a yucky baby inside an old dusty building?" Disappointed, Bento was about to load up his cars and trucks and go to the backyard. Something caught his eye. Through the window of the old building, Bento could see the man put on a white apron, and that's when Bento remembered the sign on the side of the building that said, "Golden Bread Eyrie." "Are we going to have a new bread eyrie? Do I have new neighbors?" Later that day, Bento's father arrived home from work, and as he always did, he said, "So Bento, tell me of today's news. Has the orange kitten finally caught his butterfly, or maybe his hummingbird?" Bento was full of news today and was eager to tell his father about the activity at the old building. His father was happy with the news. "Finally," said Papa, "that poor old building has been empty for too long. It will be good for the village. Bento, you have given me good news indeed." And with that, Bento got the best hug from Papa ever. "But Papa," Bento protested, still entangled in his father's long arms, there's a baby." Mama and Papa laughed, and Papa scruffed up Bento's hair, and they all sat down to dinner. Bento spent the following 3 weeks observing all the activity at the old bread eyrie. But as things inside the building were being cleaned and rearranged to make way for new things, like shelves and fresh painted signs, the old bread eyrie didn't seem so old anymore. In fact, the entire building seemed to be new, shiny, almost as if the bread eyrie had just awoken from a long nap. It won't be long now, Bento thought. He had a feeling that the new owners would soon open their doors for business. A few days later, it was Saturday, and Bento heard his mother whispering as she asked Papa, "How do you know it's even another bakery? But are you sure? Can we even afford a Sunday cake? It has been many years." Bento had never heard of a Sunday cake, but he knew it must be something very special, because Mama's eyes got bigger and were filled with tears. "Yes, my love, I am sure. Bento himself has told me of the new signs hanging inside of the old bread eyrie. It is time we follow tradition. The baker has a baby that will need the support of the village. They will need all of our support." Papa stopped whispering and said, "Bento, come with me." Bento followed Papa to the small scratched mirror that hung on the wall. At the mirror, they both checked their hair to make themselves presentable, even though it was Saturday. They never went anywhere on a Saturday, and Bento was as curious as ever, but he had an idea of where they might be going. Papa said, "We'll be back soon, Mama." And just like that, Bento and his father were off down the dirt street to the old building, which now had a big cloth banner on the front that said, "Grand Opening." Bento had barely left his front door when he could already smell a wonderful aroma in the air. "Papa, the bread eyrie is open, but where are all the customers?" "Bento, if I'm right, we are going to be the first customers of our new bread eyrie." With that news, Bento began to walk faster, but Papa put a hand on Bento's shoulder to slow him down. "It isn't proper to run inside a business, my son. We should be polite and greet our new neighbors. We should be respectful and show our gratitude to them, for we are thankful a new family has given new life to our village. It is a pleasure and an honor to be the first customer of such a fine business." Bento put his hand on the well-worn doorknob of the bread eyrie and was about to turn it and push the door open, but he stopped and looked to his father. Papa smiled and nodded. Bento pushed the door open, and as he did so, he heard a little bell ring above him. He craned his neck to see the tiniest of silver bells hanging and swinging just above the door. It was a clear little tinkling sound the bell made, and something told Bento that not just boys, but bells could also be bright. He started to close and open the door again to hear the little bell, but Papa said, "Come, Bento, the shopkeeper will be here soon enough." At that very moment, Bento heard a voice that sounded far away. "Welcome, we'll be with you in just a moment." Bento thought maybe the shopkeepers must be far in the back of the bread eyrie, or maybe upstairs changing the baby's dirty diaper. Bento wrinkled his nose and let out a little giggle. While waiting for the shopkeepers, Bento heard the giggling of a baby. He turned to see the shopkeepers coming up from the back warehouse and bakery. "Hello, welcome to Golden Bread Eyrie. I am the proud grandson of the former owner, and this is my beautiful wife and son. I'll do most of the baking, and my wife is going to do most of the shopkeeping and taking care of customers, like you." The baker bent over and looked at Bento with a kind smile as he said the words, "like you." Bento liked his soft voice, but what he liked best is that the baker didn't scruff his hair. Papa greeted the baker and his wife and baby and told them how he once knew the baker's kind and honorable grandfather. He told of the many times his family would come to the Golden Bread Eyrie to buy bread, and on Saturdays they would make a special trip to buy a Sunday cake. The baker seemed pleased, very pleased indeed, to meet such a good regular customer of his grandfather's. "Thank you for honoring my family with your patronage." This made Bento feel very proud, and he was already starting to see that his father was right. This bread eyrie would indeed be good for the village. The baker's wife said, "It's very nice to meet you and your well-mannered son." Bento had never been called well-mannered before, and as he was trying to decide if this was a good thing, Papa cleared his throat, and Bento stood up straight and said, "You are very generous, thank you." And he gave a little nod of his head in appreciation. Papa rubbed his back, like he always did when he was being a good boy, in soft small circles, round and round and round. The baker's wife began her shopkeeping duties and asked, "How may we help you today? Is that why you came? Have you come for a Sunday cake?" Bento swiftly looked at his father, eagerly waiting for his reply. Papa smiled. "It has been too long since we broke our tradition. I am happy to say that we are indeed here for our Sunday cake." With that, the baker and his wife and the giggly baby disappeared into the back. It wasn't long before the three returned with what was the most beautiful Sunday cake that Bento had ever seen. In fact, come to think of it, Bento had never seen a Sunday cake until this very moment, and he was awestruck. Was it made of gold? Look how it glistened in the sunlight beaming through the breadery window. So this is a Sunday cake, thought Bento. Papa produced 2 thin coins and laid them on the glass counter. The baker's face turned a little red as he pointed at the menu on the wall. "My apologies, I have neglected to alert you to our new menu," as his voice trailed off. Papa realized at that moment that the price of a Sunday cake was no longer what it used to be. Papa just laughed and reached into his pocket and produced 2 more thin coins. "I'm afraid it's been longer than I realized. The fault is mine." Papa shook hands with the baker and nodded to the shopkeeper. "We will see you soon. Bento, if you will open the door for Papa, I will carry the cake." Bento raced halfway to the door before he remembered his manners and stopped running. Walking the rest of the way to the door, and just before he turned the old worn knob, Bento looked up and saw the tiny little bell, and he watched as the door slowly opened and bumped ever so gently into the bell. Tinkle, tinkle, tinkle went the bell, and it was the best sound little Bento had ever heard. He opened the door wide and made way for Papa and the Sunday cake. Bento made sure to watch the bell again as he closed the door. Tinkle, tinkle, tinkle went the bell. Once home, Bento was very eager to have his first bite of cake, but Mama said, "Bento, what day is today?" "Saturday," answered Bento. "And what kind of cake is this?" asked Mama. "It's a Sunday-y." Oh! Bento was going to have to wait a whole day before he had his first bite of this very special cake. Trying to say the word tradition, Bento asked, "What's addition, Mama?" "My son, tradition is very special. Tradition is what binds a family together. Tradition ties you to Mama and to Papa and to all of our elders before us. For many generations, our family has had many traditions, and Sunday cake is just one of them." "If it's tradition, why haven't I ever had Sunday cake, Mama?" "The Golden Bread Eyrie is where the whole village used to buy Sunday cakes, those that could afford them. When the bread eyrie closed, many villagers were unable to afford the Sunday cakes from the city. We were one of those families, and we had to do without." Tears welled in Mama's eyes as she looked to Papa. Papa just smiled, and when Bento started to tell Mama how much the Sunday cake cost, Papa shook his head. The next morning, when Bento got out of bed, he'd forgotten all about the bread eyrie. He'd forgotten about the baker and his wife. He wasn't even thinking about the giggly baby. It wasn't until Bento went out to the front yard to play that he smelled the warm goodness coming from the bread eyrie. He thought to himself, the bread eyrie smells so good. And just then he remembered the Sunday cake. "Oh, I can't wait until it is Sunday. Today we honor our family with addition." And Bento raced back inside. "Mama, it's Sunday. We must—" And Papa interrupted him. "Bento, firstly, we do not run in the house, this you know. Secondly, Sunday cakes are a dessert. You may have some Sunday cake after Sunday lunch." Defeated, Bento exhaled, turned around, and went back outside. There would be no food vendors today. There would be no morning and afternoon parade for little Bento. On Sunday, the food vendors all stayed home with family. Bento figured this was their tradition and wondered if they would begin to have Sunday cake again too. While playing with his cars and truck, as he always did, Bento looked up and saw the ragman pushing his heavy cart toward town. Life could be hard for the villagers sometimes, and harder still for the ragman. Bento had seen the ragman many times, bent over his heavy cart. But today Bento decided he should speak to the ragman. Not knowing exactly what to say, Bento called out, "It is a good day, sir. Your cart will be empty when you return." With this encouragement, the ragman smiled and stood a little taller. His load seemed somehow lighter. "You are a good boy, Bento, and bright too. Please tell your mother I said hello." Bento smiled, waved, and watched the ragman until he was far down the road and could no longer be seen. Once again, Bento had forgotten all about the Sunday cake. His mind was busy thinking about the ragman and how he had not seen Orange Kitten all morning. Lost in thought, Bento wondered where Orange Kitty had been when Mama opened the door and called to Bento. "Are you hungry, little Bento? Time for your lunch." Bento went inside and washed up. After all, it's dirty business playing cars and trucks in a yard with no grass. When Bento sat down in his favorite chair at the table, he looked around at the food on the table. Mama had prepared meat on a stick, like the ones the vendor from the village sells in the city. Bento could still see steam rising from the stack of flat bread that sat on a plate next to the small pile of meat on a stick. There was also a nice bowl of beautiful white rice with small bits of vegetables mixed in. As Bento was done surveying the food on the table, something caught his eye. Over on the counter, sitting in a funny-shaped container, was the Sunday cake. Bento was so excited to see the cake and eager to start his meal. But for now, it was time to give thanks. Papa always started, next Mama, and finally little Bento, each in turn saying out loud to one another what they were thankful for on that day. Sometimes food got cold, there was so much to be thankful. But in Bento's village, the list of things to be thankful for was often a short list. Today, the family all had something in common in their list of things to be thankful for, and it was tradition. Finally, Bento was doing something his mother and father did when they were children. Bento was about to do something that his grandparents did, and their parents before them. As everyone finished their meats on a stick, flatbreads and rice, Papa began to clear the plates, and Mama got up to go sit in her favorite sitting place in the other room. Bento was confused. "But I thought, what about the Sunday cake?" Mama and Papa also looked confused. "What Sunday cake?" But they couldn't hold it any longer, and both burst out laughing. "Ha ha ha ha! Fooled you!" Mama came back to the table, and Papa got the Sunday cake from the counter. Papa also got out small plates and gave one to little Bento, and one to Mama, and kept one for himself. Papa was doing a little dance each time he sat a plate down. Next, Papa got a long knife out of the drawer Bento had never seen before. Papa bowed his head and said a few words. Papa was speaking so softly, Bento couldn't quite make out all the words. He heard words like thanks and forefathers and on this day. And then finally, Bento heard Papa say the words Sunday cake. Once again, Mama had tears in her eyes and Papa took the long knife and cut a slice of Sunday cake for everyone. Many years later, little Bento was no longer little. In fact, Bento was grown, had his own family, with 2 children of his very own. Not only did Bento grow up, so did the village. The golden bread eyrie was no longer the only business. The street was no longer dirt and now had sidewalks alongside it. Now, more people lived in the village too. One Sunday, Bento's daughter asked, "Papa, why do we have Sunday cake anyway, and what's addition?" Papa Bento smiled, and with tears in his eyes said, "Tradition is a golden ribbon of love that ties our family together. Tradition ties us together in this house, and ties us to all of our forefathers who came before us. While many families have their own tradition, and their own ways of reinforcing their own golden ribbon, our family honors tradition with Sunday cake." And so it goes in Bento's family, as it always had. Cake on Sunday. Maybe Bento's children will have Sunday cake when they grow up, and their children, and their children's children. I hope so. I bet your family has its own traditions too. Maybe your family has pot stickers for tradition, turkey on Thanksgiving. Maybe you say a few words before meals. Maybe you give thanks in your own way. Tradition can come in many forms, and the best part about tradition is you can make up your own tradition, and you can start now. Written by D. Bruner, Junior, July 20th, 2022. Read by 11 Labs, AI voice images created by Microsoft Bing AI Image Creator.